I was standing in my driveway on a Tuesday morning in late March, holding my second cup of coffee, when I noticed Patricia Hendricks marching across the cul-de-sac toward my house with the kind of purposeful stride that meant trouble. I lived in Meadowbrook Estates, a planned community just outside Columbus, Ohio, where the Homeowners Association had more power than some small governments, and Patricia sat on the board like it was her personal throne. "Logan Lancaster," she called out before she even reached my property line, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "We need to discuss your flagrant violation of community standards." I took a long sip of my coffee and waited. Patricia was in her early 50s, with that helmet haircut that seemed mandatory for HOA board members, and a wardrobe consisting entirely of khaki capris and floral blouses. She had moved into the neighborhood about 3 years ago and had immediately inserted herself into every aspect of community governance with the enthusiasm of a dictator taking over a small island nation. "Morning, Patricia," I said, keeping my tone neutral. "What violation would that be?" She stopped at the edge of my driveway, pulling out her phone and tapping at the screen with one perfectly manicured nail. "Your propane tanks. They're in clear violation of Section 12, Paragraph 8 of the Community Guidelines regarding exterior storage and safety hazards." I glanced over at my two 20-pound propane tanks sitting neatly beside my garage. I had placed them there on a concrete pad I had poured specifically for that purpose, both tanks secured with a chain to a wall-mounted bracket. They were for my grill and my backup generator, standard equipment for any reasonable homeowner. "Those tanks meet all state and county safety codes," I said. "I checked before I installed the pad." "The HOA guidelines supersede county codes when it comes to aesthetic standards," Patricia said, her lips pressing into a thin line. "Those tanks are visible from the street, which creates an eyesore and potentially impacts property values for all residents. They're gray tanks sitting against a gray garage wall, barely noticeable," I countered. "And they're essential equipment." Patricia's expression shifted into what I had come to recognize as her gotcha face. "According to our rules, all exterior storage must be approved by the Architectural Review Committee, which you failed to do. I'm reporting this violation to the county fire inspector for a safety review. If those tanks are deemed a hazard, you'll be required to remove them immediately and face fines from both the county and the HOA. You're reporting my properly installed propane tanks to the fire inspector," I said slowly, making sure I understood her correctly. "For the safety of the community," she said, pulling her phone back out. "I'm making the call right now." I watched as she dialed, spoke briefly with someone at the county office, and provided my address. She described my setup as dangerously stored explosive materials in a residential area, which was such an exaggeration that I actually laughed. She shot me a glare that could have melted steel. "The inspector will be here within the week," she announced after ending the call. "I suggest you prepare for the consequences of your recklessness." "Patricia, you might want to reconsider this approach," I said, setting my coffee cup down on the hood of my truck. "If you're calling an inspector out here for propane tanks, he's probably going to want to inspect the whole neighborhood." Her smile was pure smugness. "My tanks are properly stored inside my garage, out of sight as they should be. I have nothing to worry about." That was interesting information. I had been to the annual HOA meetings at Patricia's house before, and I distinctly remembered her garage being so packed with junk that she had to park both her cars in the driveway. If she was storing propane tanks inside that mess, the inspector was going to have a field day. "Well, I guess we'll see what the inspector says," I replied. Patricia turned on her heel and marched back toward her house, which was directly across the cul-de-sac from mine. I finished my coffee, went inside and called my buddy Mark, who worked as a contractor and knew all the building codes inside and out. "She did what?" Mark asked when I explained the situation. "Called the fire inspector on my propane tanks," I repeated. "They're on a concrete pad, secured, proper clearance from the structure, everything by the book." "You're fine then," Mark said. "But indoor storage of propane tanks over 1 pound capacity is actually against code in Ohio. They're supposed to be outside with proper ventilation. If she's got 20-pounders in her garage, especially if it's attached to the house, she's in violation of state fire code." "That's what I thought," I said. "I wasn't completely sure, but it seemed wrong." "Oh, it's definitely wrong," Mark confirmed. "Propane is heavier than air. Any leak in an enclosed space like a garage, especially an attached garage, and you've got a potential bomb. That's why the code requires outdoor storage with ventilation." We talked for a few more minutes about the specifics, and Mark offered to come by and double-check my setup just to make sure everything was perfect for the inspector's visit. He came over that afternoon, measured clearances, checked my mounting brackets, examined the concrete pad, and gave everything his approval. "You're golden," he said. "This is textbook proper installation, better than most I've seen, actually." "Thanks for checking," I said. "I just want to make sure there's no possible way she can use this against me." "The only thing that's going to happen is the inspector is going to approve your setup and move on," Mark assured me. "Unless Patricia has made other complaints about the neighborhood, in which case he might do a broader inspection." "She mentioned her own tanks," I said. "Told me they're stored in her garage." Mark's eyebrows shot up. "Then she just played herself." "The inspector's going to want to see those too, especially if she's presenting herself as the concerned citizen reporting safety violations." The inspector arrived 3 days later, on Friday morning. His name was Robert Chen, according to the ID badge clipped to his shirt, and he looked like a man who had seen every possible way people could violate fire codes and was no longer surprised by any of it. "You're Logan Lancaster?" he asked, consulting his clipboard. "That's me," I said, shaking his hand. "I understand there was a complaint about my propane storage." "Complaint came from a Patricia Hendricks," he said, checking his notes. "She reported improperly stored propane tanks creating a safety hazard. Let's take a look." I led him to the side of my garage where my tanks sat. He spent several minutes examining the setup, measuring distances with a tape measure, checking the mounting brackets, inspecting the concrete pad, and reviewing the positioning relative to doors, windows, and property lines. "This is proper installation," he said finally, making notes on his clipboard. "Outdoor storage, proper ventilation, secured against tipping, appropriate clearance from the structure and ignition sources. This meets all state and county fire codes." "That's what I thought," I said. "I researched the requirements before I set it up." "You did it right," Inspector Chen confirmed. He glanced up at Patricia's house across the street, where she was very obviously watching from her front window. "Is Mrs. Hendricks the HOA president, board member?" I said. "Very active board member. She mentioned in her complaint that she stores her own tanks properly in compliance with code," he said. "I'd like to verify that while I'm here, just for thoroughness. Since she made the complaint, she's opened herself up to inspection." I tried not to smile. "That seems reasonable." We walked across the cul-de-sac together. Patricia must have seen us coming because she opened her front door before we even reached it, stepping out onto her porch with a bright smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Inspector," she said warmly, "I trust you found the violations as reported." "No violations at Mr. Lancaster's property," Inspector Chen said professionally. His propane storage meets all applicable codes. However, you mentioned in your complaint that you maintain your own tanks in compliance with regulations. I'd like to verify your storage setup as well. Patricia's smile froze. That's not necessary. I'm sure my tanks are fine. It's standard procedure when investigating a complaint to verify that the complainant's own property meets the same codes, he said. It helps ensure we're applying standards fairly across the community. I really don't think that's required, Patricia said, her voice taking on an edge. Madam, you filed a formal safety complaint with the county, Inspector Chen said, his tone remaining pleasant but firm. That opens your property to inspection under the same safety standards. I can either do a voluntary inspection now or I can come back with a formal inspection order. Your choice. Patricia's jaw tightened, but she managed to maintain her forced smile. Of course, I have nothing to hide. My tanks are stored safely in my garage. In your garage, Inspector Chen repeated, and I saw his expression shift slightly. An attached garage. Yes, out of sight where they don't create an eyesore for the neighborhood, Patricia said, shooting a pointed look at me. Inspector Chen made a note on his clipboard. Let's take a look. Patricia led us around to her two-car garage. The door was closed, and when she hit the button to open it, I had to suppress a reaction. The garage was even more packed than I remembered. Boxes were stacked along every wall. Holiday decorations spilled out of torn containers. Old furniture was piled in corners, and various pieces of lawn equipment were crammed into whatever space remained. In the far back corner, partially hidden behind a stack of storage bins, I could see two propane tanks. Inspector Chen stood at the entrance for a moment, surveying the scene. Those are your propane tanks back in the corner. Yes, Patricia said, her confidence wavering slightly. The inspector carefully made his way through the cluttered garage, moving boxes aside to reach the tanks. He spent several minutes examining them and the surrounding area, taking measurements and photos with his phone. Mrs. Hendricks, he said finally, his voice taking on a more serious tone. These tanks are in violation of multiple fire safety codes. Patricia's face went pale. What? No, they're stored properly. They're inside, protected from the elements. That's actually the problem, Inspector Chen explained. Ohio Fire Code specifically prohibits storage of propane tanks exceeding 1 pound capacity in attached garages or any enclosed space connected to a living area. Propane is heavier than air, which means any leak will sink and accumulate at the lowest point. In an enclosed space like this, that creates an extreme explosion hazard. But they've been here for years, Patricia protested. That doesn't make them compliant, he said. Furthermore, you have these tanks stored within 3 feet of this electrical outlet, which is a violation of clearance requirements for ignition sources. And they're not secured against tipping. Any one of these violations would be serious. All 3 together constitute an immediate safety hazard. This is ridiculous, Patricia snapped, her pleasant facade crumbling. They're just propane tanks. Everyone has them. Everyone has them, but they're required to store them in compliance with fire safety codes, Inspector Chen said. Mr. Lancaster's tanks are stored correctly, outdoors with proper ventilation and clearances. Yours are creating a genuine danger to yourself and your neighbors. What does that mean? Patricia demanded. It means I'm issuing a condemnation order for this storage setup, he said, pulling a form from his clipboard. These tanks must be removed from the garage immediately. I'm giving you 24 hours to relocate them to compliant outdoor storage or remove them from the property entirely. If you fail to comply, the county can pursue fines up to $500 per day, and in extreme cases, we can pursue criminal charges for reckless endangerment. Patricia's face had gone from pale to bright red. "You can't be serious." "I'm completely serious," Inspector Chen said. "This is a significant safety violation. Additionally, I'm recommending a full property inspection of your garage to ensure there are no other fire hazards in this space. Based on what I'm seeing, there are other potential issues here." He began writing on his form, documenting everything he had found. Patricia stood frozen, apparently unable to process that her complaint had backfired so spectacularly. "I'm also going to note in my report that this inspection was prompted by your complaint about a neighbor's compliant installation," Inspector Chen continued. "The county takes false or malicious complaints seriously. If we determine that you filed this complaint knowing your own setup was non-compliant, there may be additional penalties." "I didn't know," Patricia said quickly, her voice rising. "I had no idea the storage was wrong." "Ignorance of fire codes doesn't eliminate liability," he said, handing her a copy of the condemnation order. "24 hours, Mrs. Hendricks. I'll be back Monday morning to verify compliance." We walked back across the street to my house, where Inspector Chen completed his paperwork and provided me with a copy of his inspection report showing my installation was in full compliance with all applicable codes. "Thank you for your time," I said. "Just doing my job," he replied. Though I'll admit, it's not often someone reports a violation and ends up being the one cited. You might want to document this whole situation in case there are further issues with your HOA. "That's good advice," I said. After he left, I stood in my driveway and watched Patricia through her front windows, pacing back and forth with her phone pressed to her ear. I felt a small amount of sympathy for her, but it was severely limited by the fact that she had tried to cause trouble for me out of pure spite and had only herself to blame for the consequences. The rest of Friday passed quietly, but by Saturday morning, word had spread through the neighborhood. My next-door neighbor, Tom, came over while I was washing my truck. "Is it true Patricia got cited by the fire inspector?" he asked. "Where did you hear that?" I replied. "Susan from 3 houses down saw the inspector at both your places," Tom said. "And Patricia has been calling everyone on the HOA board. Apparently, she's trying to claim the inspector was biased." "He wasn't biased," I said. "He just enforced the actual fire codes. My tanks are installed correctly, hers weren't." Tom grinned. "This is the best thing that's happened in this neighborhood in years. Patricia's been on a power trip ever since she joined the board. Someone needed to take her down a peg." I wasn't necessarily interested in taking anyone down, but I wasn't going to deny that there was some justice in the situation. Patricia had spent 3 years making life difficult for various residents over minor or imagined violations of HOA rules. She had fined people for having their trash cans visible from the street for more than 12 hours, for planting flowers that weren't on the approved color palette, for parking cars in driveways overnight instead of in garages. The woman had turned neighborhood management into a personal crusade for absolute control. By Sunday afternoon, I received an email from the HOA board requesting my presence at an emergency meeting that evening. The email was signed by Patricia and 2 other board members, Jennifer and David. The subject line read, "Urgent, Community Safety Discussion." I showed up at the community clubhouse at 7 o'clock, finding about 15 other residents already there, which was unusual. Most HOA meetings drew maybe 5 or 6 people unless there was a major issue. Word had definitely gotten around. Patricia sat at the front table with Jennifer and David, looking like she had aged 5 years in the past 2 days. She called the meeting to order and immediately launched into a prepared statement. "We've called this emergency meeting to address a serious situation regarding propane tank storage in our community," she began, her voice strained. "Recent events have highlighted the need for clearer guidelines on this issue." "You mean the fact that you got condemned while Logan passed inspection?" Someone called from the back. I turned to see it was Mike, a retired firefighter who lived 2 streets over. Patricia's face flushed. "The inspector's findings are being disputed." "On what grounds?" Mike asked, standing up. "I used to be a fire inspector before I retired. Indoor storage of propane tanks in attached garages violates state code. That's not debatable. The point is," Patricia said loudly, talking over him, "we need to establish community standards that go beyond minimum code requirements." "To do what?" I asked, speaking up for the first time. "Require everyone to store their tanks the wrong way because you did it wrong." "No one is suggesting that," David interjected, clearly trying to play peacemaker. "We're just trying to find a solution that works for everyone." "The solution already exists," Mike said. "It's called following fire code. Tanks go outside, properly secured with appropriate clearances. End of story." "But that creates aesthetic issues," Patricia insisted. "This is a planned community with appearance standards." "Then mandate that outdoor propane storage be located in inconspicuous locations," Jennifer suggested. "Behind garages, against side walls, wherever they're least visible but still code compliant." "That's basically what most people already do," Tom pointed out. "Logan's tanks are barely visible from the street. You have to actually look for them." Patricia glared at me like this was all somehow my fault. "The issue is that Logan failed to get Architectural Review Committee approval before installing his storage pad." "Did you get approval for storing propane in your garage?" I asked. "That's different," she snapped. "How?" I pressed. "Because it didn't involve exterior construction," she said. "But it did involve creating a serious safety hazard that could have blown up your house and potentially damaged neighboring properties," Mike added. "I'd say that's a bigger issue than whether someone got permission for a concrete pad." The meeting devolved from there. Patricia tried repeatedly to steer the conversation toward criticizing my installation. But every time she did, someone pointed out that the fire inspector had approved my setup and condemned hers. Other residents began sharing their own experiences with Patricia's overzealous enforcement of HOA rules, and it became clear that years of accumulated resentment were spilling out. David finally called for order. "Look, it's clear we need to update our propane storage guidelines. I propose we create a new rule requiring outdoor storage in compliance with state fire codes, with placement that minimizes visibility from streets where possible. Any installation requiring a permanent pad or structure would need architectural review, but the storage itself would be allowed as long as it meets safety codes." "I second that," Jennifer said immediately. The motion passed by a show of hands from everyone in the room except Patricia, who abstained. She looked furious. "This meeting is adjourned," she said curtly, gathering her papers and leaving without another word. I talked with several neighbors after the meeting, and the consensus was that Patricia had finally overplayed her hand. Her attempt to use the fire inspector as a weapon against me had backfired completely, and she had lost a significant amount of credibility with both the board and the general community. Monday morning, I was working from home when I saw Inspector Chen's vehicle pull up to Patricia's house. I resisted the urge to watch from my window like a nosy neighbor, but I definitely heard raised voices at one point. About 30 minutes later, the inspector left, and Patricia's garage door closed. I didn't hear anything more about it until Tuesday, When Tom came over to tell me that Patricia had hired a contractor to pour a concrete pad beside her garage and relocate her propane tanks. Apparently, she had scrambled over the weekend to get quotes and had paid a premium for rush service to meet the 24-hour deadline, though the inspector had given her until Monday morning, which meant she technically had until then. Cost her about $800 for the pad and installation, Tom said, plus whatever fines the county assessed for the original violation. That's expensive revenge, I observed. Self-inflicted, though, Tom pointed out. She could have just minded her own business. Over the next few weeks, things settled into a new normal. Patricia was noticeably less aggressive at HOA meetings, and several other board members began pushing back against her more extreme positions. The propane storage guidelines were officially updated to reflect fire code requirements, and the Architectural Review Committee was reorganized to make the approval process more streamlined and less arbitrary. I thought the whole situation was behind us until about 6 weeks after the inspector's visit, when I received a certified letter from Patricia's attorney. My stomach sank as I opened it, expecting some kind of lawsuit. Instead, it was a letter demanding payment for damages to reputation and emotional distress caused by my malicious actions in setting up an inspection trap. The letter claimed I had deliberately positioned my propane tanks to be visible knowing it would provoke a complaint, and then had somehow coordinated with the fire inspector to target Patricia's property. The claims were absurd, but they still made my blood pressure rise. I immediately called my own attorney, a guy named Marcus who had helped me with my home purchase. "This is a shakedown," Marcus said after I read him the letter. "She's trying to intimidate you into paying her off to avoid legal costs. Notice how they're not actually filing a lawsuit. They're just threatening one." "So what do?" I asked. We respond with our own letter pointing out that she initiated the inspection, that all inspector findings were based on legitimate code violations and compliance, and that her claims are baseless, Marcus said. "We'll also note that if she does choose to file a frivolous lawsuit, we'll pursue sanctions and attorney's fees." Marcus drafted a response that was professional but firm, and we sent it off. I never heard from Patricia's attorney again, though Patricia herself continued to give me cold glares whenever we crossed paths in the neighborhood. Life in Meadowbrook Estates continued, and summer arrived with its usual heat and humidity. I used my propane grill regularly, secure in the knowledge that my tanks were properly stored and fully approved by the county. I saw Patricia outside occasionally, and I noticed she had positioned some decorative shrubs around her new propane storage pad, presumably to make it less visible from the street. The situation took another turn in early July when I attended the monthly HOA meeting. Patricia was absent, which was unusual since she rarely missed meetings. David, who was chairing in her absence, made an announcement that caught everyone's attention. "I wanted to inform everyone that Patricia Hendricks has resigned from the HOA board, effective immediately," he said. "She cited personal reasons and a desire to focus on other priorities." There was a moment of stunned silence, then a ripple of conversation through the room. Tom, sitting next to me, leaned over and whispered, "Did we just win?" After the meeting, Jennifer approached me in the parking lot. "I wanted you to know what really happened," she said quietly. "Patricia didn't exactly resign voluntarily. Several of us on the board confronted her about her behavior, including the situation with the fire inspector. We pointed out that she had cost the HOA credibility and had exposed us to potential liability with her harassment of residents." "What kind of liability?" I asked. "If you had sued the HOA over her targeting you, we would have had a hard time defending her actions," Jennifer explained. Especially since she filed what amounted to a false complaint with the county. Our HOA insurance wouldn't have covered that kind of malicious behavior. We told her she needed to step down or we would call for a vote to remove her. So she chose to resign, I said. She wasn't happy about it, but yes, Jennifer confirmed. I'm sorry you got caught up in all of this. Patricia had been getting progressively worse over the past year, and we should have addressed it sooner. I appreciate you telling me, I said. As I drove home that night, I reflected on how the whole situation had unfolded. What had started as Patricia trying to cause trouble for me over a petty grievance had ended with her losing her position on the HOA board and having to completely redo her own propane storage at significant expense. It was a clear case of karma, and while I hadn't intended for things to escalate to that point, I couldn't say I was sorry about the outcome. The neighborhood definitely felt different after Patricia's departure from the board. The HOA became noticeably less aggressive about enforcing minor violations, and there was more focus on actual community improvement rather than policing residents' every move. The Architectural Review Committee started approving requests that had been languishing for months, and several people took the opportunity to make improvements they had been putting off. In late August, I was surprised to see a "For sale" sign go up in Patricia's yard. Tom saw it the same day and came over to discuss it. "She's moving?" he asked, clearly delighted by this development. "Looks that way," I said. "Can't say I'm sorry to see her go," Tom admitted. "Think it's because of everything that happened, maybe," I said. "Or maybe she just realized she'd burned too many bridges here to be comfortable anymore." The house sold quickly, and by October, Patricia was gone. A young couple with 2 kids moved in, and they were friendly and easygoing, a welcome change. The father, whose name was Kyle, came over to introduce himself one weekend and mentioned he had heard there had been some drama with the previous owner. "Nothing too serious," I said diplomatically. "Just some HOA disagreements." "Well, everyone we've met so far has been great," Kyle said. "We're happy to be here." I helped him and his wife Sarah get their propane grill set up, showing them where the fire codes required the tanks to be positioned. They were grateful for the information and had their own setup compliant from day one. As autumn turned to winter, I occasionally thought about the whole situation with Patricia. It was a reminder that trying to use rules and regulations as weapons against neighbors usually backfired. If she had just focused on legitimate community concerns instead of petty grievances, she could have been an effective board member. Instead, she had let her need for control turn into vindictiveness, and it had cost her credibility, money, and eventually her home. The new HOA board, which had added 2 new members in a special election to replace Patricia and one other person who had termed out, took a much more reasonable approach to community governance. They focused on maintaining common areas, organizing neighborhood events, and only intervening in situations that genuinely affected property values or safety. It was what the HOA should have been all along. I kept the letter from the fire inspector approving my propane installation in my files, along with all the correspondence related to Patricia's attempted complaint. Marcus had advised me to keep everything documented in case there were any future issues, though he doubted Patricia would try anything else after her attorney's demand letter had been rebuffed. One evening in December, I was sitting on my back porch despite the cold, enjoying a bourbon and reflecting on the year. It had been an eventful one, certainly more dramatic than I had anticipated when I woke up that March morning to see Patricia marching across the street. But it had also been instructive. I had learned the importance of following proper codes and regulations, the value of documentation, and the fact that sometimes standing up to bullies, even HOA bullies, was worth the stress and confrontation. My propane tanks continued to sit beside my garage, properly secured on their concrete pad, fully compliant with all applicable codes. They were a daily reminder that doing things the right way, even when it seemed like overkill, could save you a lot of trouble down the road. The neighborhood settled into its winter routine. Holiday lights went up, following the new, more reasonable HOA guidelines that allowed displays from Thanksgiving through New Year's, rather than the previous arbitrary cutoff date Patricia had enforced. Kids built snowmen in yards. The community looked warm and welcoming, the way it was supposed to. I ran into Jennifer at the grocery store in mid-December, and she mentioned that the HOA had just completed its best year in terms of resident satisfaction surveys. Complaints were down, participation in community events was up, and several people had commented on how much more pleasant the neighborhood felt. Turns out removing one toxic element can really change the whole dynamic, she said. We should have dealt with Patricia's behavior a long time ago. Well, it worked out in the end, I said, as I drove home with my groceries, past houses decorated for the holidays and yards where kids were playing in the snow. I felt genuinely content. Meadowbrook Estates was a good place to live, made better by the absence of someone who had treated it as her personal fiefdom. The propane tank situation had been an unexpected catalyst for positive change, and while I hadn't sought out that role, I was glad things had turned out the way they had. My last interaction related to the whole situation came in January, almost a full year after it had started, when I received a letter from the county fire marshal's office. It was a form letter thanking me for maintaining compliant propane storage and informing me that my property had been used as a positive example in updated fire safety materials for the county. Apparently, Inspector Chen had photographed my installation as a demonstration of proper outdoor propane storage, and it was now part of the educational materials they provided to residents. I had to laugh at that. Patricia had tried to use the fire inspector to get me in trouble, and instead, my setup had become the county's model for how things should be done. It was a fitting end to the whole saga. As winter progressed, and the one-year anniversary of the initial confrontation approached, I thought about writing down the whole story as a cautionary tale about HOA overreach, and the importance of following actual safety codes rather than arbitrary aesthetic rules. But mostly, I just enjoyed the peace and quiet of living in a neighborhood where people focused on being good neighbors rather than enforcing petty regulations. Kyle and Sarah next door had become good friends. We had dinner together regularly, and their kids were polite and fun to have around. They were everything Patricia hadn't been: considerate, reasonable, and focused on building community rather than controlling it. The HOA board continued to function smoothly under its new composition. David proved to be an excellent president, and the other board members worked collaboratively to address actual issues rather than creating problems where none existed. The neighborhood thrived under their more measured approach. I maintained my propane tanks exactly as I always had, and every time I used my grill or tested my backup generator, I was reminded of the importance of doing things properly from the start. If I had cut corners or ignored the fire codes, Patricia's complaint could have caused me real problems. Instead, my diligence had protected me and had ultimately exposed her own violations. The concrete pad beside my garage was a permanent reminder of the whole situation. I had poured it myself, carefully measuring to ensure proper clearances and positioning. That attention to detail had saved me thousands in potential fines and legal fees, and had ultimately contributed to positive change in the neighborhood. As March arrived and the weather began to warm, I found myself standing in my driveway one morning with a cup of coffee, exactly as I had been standing 1 year earlier when Patricia had marched over to confront me. This time, though, the view across the cul-de-sac showed Kyle and Sarah's house, with Kyle outside washing his car and waving when he saw me looking. I waved back and smiled. The neighborhood was finally what it should be, a community of people living their lives without undue interference or harassment. The propane tank saga had been stressful and unnecessary, but it had ultimately made Meadowbrook Estates a better place to live. My tanks sat beside my garage, gray against gray, barely visible from the street, exactly as they should be. They were functional, compliant, and safe. And most importantly, they were nobody's business but my own, unless they actually violated some legitimate code or regulation. That was how it should work in a free country, and I was glad to have played a small part in reinforcing that principle in my community. The whole experience had taught me several valuable lessons. First, always follow proper codes and regulations, because they exist for good reasons. Second, document everything when dealing with potentially hostile HOA members. Third, sometimes standing up to bullies is not only the right thing to do but can lead to positive change for everyone. And fourth, karma is real, especially when it comes to people who try to use rules and regulations as weapons against their neighbors. I finished my coffee and went inside to start my workday, grateful for the peace and quiet that now characterized life in Meadowbrook Estates. The drama was over, the neighborhood was better for it, and my propane tanks remained exactly where they belonged, properly stored and fully compliant. It was a satisfying conclusion to what had been an unexpectedly contentious chapter in my life as a homeowner. The story of Patricia Hendricks and the propane tank inspection became something of a legend in the neighborhood. New residents would hear about it and often come to look at my installation as a reference for their own setups. I was always happy to explain what I had done and why, and to emphasize the importance of following fire codes rather than just doing what seemed convenient. Inspector Chen actually stopped by one more time, about 6 months after the original inspection, to verify that both my installation and Patricia's former property remained in compliance. He was pleased to see that everything was still properly maintained, and mentioned that the incident had led to the county doing more proactive outreach about propane safety. "We've done 3 community workshops since then," he told me. "Lots of people had no idea they were storing their tanks incorrectly. We've probably prevented several potential accidents thanks to that inspection." "Glad some good came out of it," I said. "More than you know," he replied. That situation was a perfect example of why we do what we do. Safety codes aren't arbitrary. They're based on real risks and real consequences. As the second year in the aftermath of the incident passed, life continued its normal rhythm. The HOA remained functional and reasonable. The neighborhood maintained its property values and its sense of community. And my propane tanks continued to sit beside my garage, a mundane but important piece of equipment that had inadvertently become a symbol of standing up for what was right. Looking back on the entire situation, I realized that if Patricia had approached me differently from the start, everything could have been avoided. If she had knocked on my door and expressed concern about the visibility of my tanks rather than immediately threatening to report me, we could have had a conversation. Maybe I would have agreed to plant some shrubs to screen them better. Maybe she would have learned that they were properly installed and decided it wasn't worth worrying about. Instead, she had chosen confrontation and attempted intimidation, and it had backfired completely. The lesson was clear. In a community setting, cooperation and communication were far more effective than threats and regulations. The new HOA board understood this, and the neighborhood was thriving as a result. Property values had actually increased over the past year, partly because word had gotten out that Meadowbrook Estates was a great place to live with a reasonable HOA, which was increasingly rare in the area. I continued to participate in HOA meetings and to volunteer for neighborhood events. I felt a responsibility to help maintain the positive changes that had occurred, and to make sure the board stayed focused on its proper role of maintaining and improving the community, rather than micromanaging residents' lives. The propane tank saga had been an unexpected adventure in homeownership, but it had ultimately reinforced my belief in the importance of following proper procedures, standing up for yourself when necessary, and letting karma take care of the rest. Patricia Hendricks had tried to make my life difficult and had ended up making her own life much harder instead. That wasn't my doing. It was simply the natural consequence of her own choices and actions. As I settled into another evening at home, with my grill ready for cooking and my backup generator ready for any power outages, I felt genuinely grateful for how everything had turned out. The neighborhood was peaceful, my equipment was properly installed and fully legal, and the days of HOA overreach seemed to be firmly in the past. It was everything I had hoped for when I had bought my home in Meadowbrook Estates, and it had taken a confrontation over propane tanks to finally make it a reality. The concrete pad beside my garage was more than just a functional installation now. It was a reminder that doing things right mattered, that standing up for yourself mattered, and that sometimes the smallest conflicts could lead to the most significant positive changes. I would never regret the stress and hassle of dealing with Patricia's complaint, because the end result had been worth it for everyone in the community. My final thought on the whole situation came one evening as I was grilling dinner for some neighbors. Kyle made a joke about my tanks being famous, and everyone laughed. But beneath the humor was a genuine appreciation for the fact that the neighborhood had changed for the better, and that we could all enjoy our homes without constant worry about petty HOA enforcement. To proper propane storage, Tom said, raising his beer in a toast. And to reasonable HOA boards, Jennifer added. We all clinked our drinks together, and I felt a deep sense of satisfaction. The propane tank saga was over, but its positive effects would last for years. Meadowbrook Estates was a better community because someone had finally stood up to the petty tyranny that had been masquerading as community governance. I was proud to have been that person, even though I had never sought the role. As the sun set over the neighborhood and the grill sizzled with burgers and hot dogs, I looked at my properly installed, fully compliant, fire inspector-approved propane tanks and smiled. They were exactly where they should be, doing exactly what they were supposed to do, bothering absolutely nobody. And that was exactly how life in a good neighborhood should be.